You have to have a high view of the Bible. You have to affirm the doctrine of inerrancy. And more importantly, you have to affirm the doctrine of the sufficiency of Scripture, right? So I said this the other week in class, talking about the doctrines of necessity and sufficiency, right? So you'll hear a lot of churches and associations, denominations, oh, of course the Bible's necessary. But what we forget is that the Bible is sufficient. So we say we need the Bible, necessity, but then sufficiency is it is all that we need. And so many churches, schools, denominations, what have you, the reason they begin drifting is they don't believe the Bible is all they need.
Welcome to the Pastor and Postmaster podcast. What you wanted to hear in the sermon, but you didn't.
And where the Academy meets every day.
Speaking of Academy, I think that's going to be a good discussion today. And we have a special guest, a personal friend of mine.
Really?
Yeah.
Who's that?
He's here on the screen.
Dude.
But you can't, I'm over here. Hello.
There he is.
Okay.
Cameron Schweitzer, Dr. Cameron Schweitzer, who is the director of the Gateway Seminary San Francisco campus and also associate professor of church history and theology. You know, we both teach kind of the same classes in separate places.
We do.
He's kind
So
of
is he your boss?
basically.
Oh,
I report to
okay.
him of some form. Yes.
Okay, so he's your first report.
Yes.
Okay.
This was not a request he made. I actually volunteered to have him on here because I want to talk a little bit about training for pastors. But, you know, before we get to that, because we are Baptists, we're evangelicals, tell us a little about yourself and especially your testimony, because I think that's a cool thing for everyone here to know.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So thank you guys for having me on. It's such a pleasure. And as I said to you earlier, and I'll say on the recording, this is my first ever podcast. So let's see if this is the first of many or one done. We'll see. Time will tell. So as I was saying earlier, I'm a native of Southern California. I grew up not in the nice part. So I didn't grow up in like the beach or the mountains. I grew up in the flat brown land.
My brother.
There you go, man.
Yeah.
I grew up in a city called Yucaipa. So Yucaipa and Redlands are my two hometowns.
Yep.
To make a very long story short, though, I've gotten very good at telling my testimony because doing what I've done for Gateway and Golden Gate over the last 10 years, I've met with well over 1,000 ministry leaders, like
Wow.
over coffee or lunch or breakfast. And so then you have to nail down, so I've shared who I am, what I've done. I can do it in 5 minutes flat. So I guess I'll do that. I grew up in Southern California. I was a bastard child. My parents were never married. And my mom left my dad, who at the time was selling drugs. My mom didn't have the best choice in men. She met my dad when my older half-sister Melanie had terminal cancer. And my mom at the time was a pediatric oncologist nurse at Loma Linda Children's Hospital.
Seventh-day Adventist, yeah.
Yep. So my older sister Melanie, my youngest half-older sister, had terminal cancer at like 3, 4, 5 years old. But she survived by the grace of God. And so that's how my parents met. They were together for probably 2 or 3 years. My mom then left when I was around 2. And so for me, growing up was pretty much at my mom's house, and then every other weekend at my dad's, and then a month during the summer, and then alternating holidays. And I hated going to my dad's house because it was in a city called Hemet, which was
Oh, yeah.
far.
Oh, I know Hemet.
Far off in the middle of nowhere. But we grew up looking back, and it's funny having the conversation earlier about like this sort of area of California. At the time, my dad was a ranch hand of a massive, like hundreds and hundreds of acre duck hunting ranch that had been bankrolled by all these millionaires, like former athletes, and who wanted to go out and duck hunt. And so my dad was the ranch hand. And so growing up, looking back, if I would have had a good relationship with my dad, I would have loved it. Because it was this huge ranch with ponds and just tons of space and beautiful views of the mountains. But I hated it. Grew up going to a Catholic church with my mom. And then when my dad got into the late 90s, he was converted at a Harvest Crusade under Greg Laurie. So then growing up, we would go to the Calvary Chapel in Moreno Valley. And so a few years ago, I found an old childhood Bible that my dad had given me. And I had underlined like the entire Vineyard Discourse.
No way.
And so even as I had my reprobate years as a middle schooler and a high schooler, the Lord had gotten a hold of me when I was young. And so got into middle school, and I disdained going to my father's house. And so without going to court, we essentially said, hey, we don't want to go here anymore. My dad didn't fight it. So then I was only at my mom's house, and that's when I started to get into trouble. In middle school, did a bunch of different things where I was foolishly pursuing the things of the world. And it got to a point because of the hatred and the vitriol I was experiencing from other young men in the community that I couldn't stay at my middle school. I had to go on independent study for a while. It wasn't safe for me to go to school. And so I ended up getting to a Christian prep school, the city down in Redlands. And they only let me in because of my grades. And so I'd always really enjoyed school, been good at school, but my behaviors were very, very bad. So they let me in. And I kid you not, the director of admissions at that time was a lady named Betty Crocker. And I saw Betty Crocker years later. And when she found out what I was doing in college and the man I'd become, in tears, she looked at me and said, "I'm so thankful we took a chance on you." And to make a long story short, over those years in high school, God initially called me to ministry when I was in 9th grade. And I wouldn't say I had my conversion experience yet. It was sort of like God called me to ministry before I got called to salvation. And that call terrified me. So I spent the rest of high school fleeing from that. And so in high school, I was living two lives. One in Redlands at my school. I was a good athlete, a good student, knew all the answers in Bible class. Everyone wanted to have me debate the people who were being brought into class, and I would do it. But then at home, I was, still chasing girls, smoking pot, drinking, not telling my mom what I was doing, and, doing a lot of bad things. And then by the time I became a senior in high school, this is now 2008, this is the year Obama's running for election, and this is the Prop 8 debate year in California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at the time, here I am in this little Christian school, and I still remember there was a mock election, and it was like 98% voted for Obama and against gay marriage. And I'm the only one of the only people who is now vocally for Obama and vocally for gay marriage. And so now, by the time I'm a senior in high school, I'm clearly not a Christian. And now I'm pushing back against Mr. Rice, my high school Bible teacher. I'm making fun of all the Christians. I'm openly advocating these things that I am. And now around that time, my best friend in high school is a guy named Jeremiah. And he was dating this young girl named Brianna Dickey. And her family, we all met at the beach one day, and they saw how lost I was. And so they, just like Paul said, don't forsake to show hospitality. Practice, right? Show hospitality, and they did. And so they would have me and Jeremiah over every Tuesday night for dinner. And her mom was an amazing cook. They would make amazing dinners and care about us and take an interest in us. And the funny thing is, Jeremiah and Brianna ended up breaking up a few months later. But then each one in that family reached out to the dad, the mom, and Brianna. And they'd all become very close to me. They said, "Hey, would you still keep coming here?" Jeremiah didn't like that, but they'd become so dear to me. And so I was in their lives for probably about 9 months. And then they invited me to church. And this is now the last semester of my high school year. I am doing the worst things you could as you could at that age. I mean, not like serious stuff, but like as a 17-year-old, you're doing some crazy stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so they invited me to church, and I had not willingly gone to church in 4, 5, 6 years at this point. And now, mind you, I went to a good Christian school. Like it was an evangelical school. It was in the sort of Dutch Reformed tradition. So I had good Bible teachers who were sharing the gospel. There was people in chapel, I'm sure, sharing the gospel. Even as I remember some of the silly people who came and would say the silly things they did. Like the guy who invented the dog igloo was really funny. Or the like power lifters who tore the books.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. Yeah. So anyways, I'd heard the gospel. I'd, gone to church as a kid periodically, but I was, hearing but not hearing. And so then Brianna and her mom invited me to church. And I still remember thinking, what the heck? Like, it'd make them happy. It'd be good for me to go to church. I've not gone in a long time. Let's go. So I went to Harvest Christian Church, is that mega church in Riverside, California. And on Sunday evenings at the time, they had this thing called Day 7 service, or Sunday. It was something like that. And the guy pastoring that was not Greg Laurie. It was a guy named Steve Wilburn, who's now a church planter of a church called the Rock Church, or the Solid Rock Church in like downtown LA. So anyways, that night he preached what I would refer to as a non-exegetical sermon on 1 Corinthians 5. Huh. And so he had allegorized that idea of like casting out the yeast from the dough. And instead of like this idea, we were talking about church discipline earlier. So instead of like this, that text is about corporate church discipline, and so we know what the text is about, but he made it about casting out the sin in your own heart.
Allegory.
So it's very right doctrine,
Jerome-ish.
Right doctrine, wrong text. Right doctrine, wrong text.
Yep, book on that.
So anyways, there I was in this massive church with thousands of people, and every word of that sermon felt like it was directed at me. Every one of it. And at the time, I'm 17, almost 18 years old. I knew 3 things I wanted to do. I wanted to escape the hot, crowded place of the Inland Empire. I wanted to go live at the beach, because that's where I spent all my summers, Huntington, San Diego, Newport, my Mecca. And I wanted to make a lot of money and live a playboy lifestyle. And I was going to be a lawyer. That's what I knew I wanted to do, and I was going to be able to achieve all those things, and I was going to finally get out of the Inland Empire. And when it came time to go to choose where I wanted to go to college, I knew I wanted to live at the beach. I wanted to party and get a good education.
Point Loma.
Not Point Loma. So I was looking at
Sorry.
I was looking, at like Berkeley, Santa Barbara, San Diego, Stanford, these sorts of places. And then I ended up choosing Santa Barbara, and I did get to live at the beach for 1 year, right on Campus Point. So anyways, I tell people, look, if you're doing youth ministry or you're engaged in evangelism, just know that I was like the most foul-mouthed, sinful 17-year-old who would have mocked you for your faith the day before God converted me.
Wow.
Like radical.
Absolutely.
And so it was a night and day conversion. And so there I was in Harvest that Sunday night in February 2009. And then they do the mega church altar call, right? Like they bring out the guitar player who's playing in like C minor or something like that very emotional sort of music. And it's like, I believe there's one more person out there. And there I am in the pew. I still remember I was sitting next to the sound board in the middle of the church in this pew. And it was as if, like it says in Acts, my eyes were open for the first time. And I saw the ugliness of my sin and the beauty of Jesus. And very audibly was the voice in my heart. My voice, I don't know. It was just, I've paid for your sins. I've risen from the grave. Repent and believe in me. So I didn't raise my hand. I didn't walk down the aisle. I didn't pray the sinner's prayer. I wept in the pew and I just said, Lord, please save me. Please save me. And then Brianna and her mom put their arms around me and prayed for me. My life was radically changed. To such an effect that when I got back to school in the next couple of weeks, people thought I was now just pretending to be a Christian to mock them. But then it was sort of like the right hand of fellowship was extended to me by my Bible teacher, Dan Rice, like they did with Saul. And said, no, this guy's legit. And so then they ended up having me speak in senior chapel and giving my testimony and sharing a word. And what was so funny is I had all my, I keep calling professors, but teachers come up to me and say, Cameron, you need to go into ministry. The Lord has called you to this. And then there I am remembering the thing that God did while I was 14 as a freshman. Came rushing back. At the time, I thought, I'm still going to be a lawyer, but I'm going to follow the Lord and I'll be faithful. I get to UC Santa Barbara to wrap up my story. And over one particular week, the Lord made really clear to me that I needed to forgo the path I was on and pursue pastoral ministry. And so after my first year at Santa Barbara, I transferred to California Baptist in Riverside, where I double majored in philosophy and theology, studied apologetics as well, and did that in 3 years. And the joke I always tell is that there I was at Christian about a year and a half in my classrooms with a bunch of like youth group all-stars and pastors and missionaries kids. And there I am like this, I have long hair down on my shoulders, very, very rough, but just like eager to learn, soaked everything up. And the funny thing is I look back over the years now, how many of my classmates are no longer in ministry?
Wow.
The majority. Mm-hmm. And the handful of us, and the funny thing too is this will only be germane to a handful of people, that at Cal Baptist there's a very particular program called the BAP program, or the Applied Theology program. I was rejected from that program by one of the nicest men in the world named Dan Wilson. But he then called me personally and said, hey, you should still come and double major in Christian studies, which is not the specialized degree, and then double major in philosophy, and I'll get you in all the same class sections as the BAT students are in. So anyways, I know a lot of the BAT students who aren't in ministry anymore, and then there's a handful of us who were the rejected BAT students, who were CST students, and then like philosophy students who were the ones still in ministry, which is so funny.
Oh, the off-scourings of the world.
I know, right? The refuse, the foolish, the weak.
The long hair, bro.
It was the long hair, man. They used to call me Thor, believe it or not.
Oh,
Drop the hammer.
long
Thor.
blonde hair.
Yeah, that's right. And so as I get near to the end of my CBU degree, praying where the Lord would have me go to seminary, and all my professors at the time were telling me, hey, Cameron, you need to go to the East Coast. We want you to go to an Ivy League school or a big seminary because we want you to get a PhD. And at the time, I'm still thinking, no, the Lord called me to ministry. Like, that's what I need to be a pastor. And so the great irony is that to this day, I've never been a pastor. I've worked for the seminary for 10 years. Yeah. I'm an ordained Southern Baptist minister, but I've never been a paid pastor. I've been an intern, a pastoral associate, things like that. So anyways, the Lord made it very clear to me I needed to stay in Southern California, move back home with my mom, who's now, single. Her kids are all out of the house, and I could tell she was lonely. So I moved back home that summer. Golden Gate offered me a very, very good scholarship. And so then I went to our Southern California campus. And the next year was when Golden Gate announced they were moving to become, to transition from Mill Valley to Southern California. Later that year, I'm looking for work. And I got hired by Adam Grozas. He would often joke that he found me on the side of the road begging for food, took me to Lazy Dog, gave me a dinner, and gave me a job. So there I was, 23 years old, fourth semester of seminary, now essentially being tasked with like starting the recruiting and admissions task for Golden Gate Seminary in Southern California. So then I've worked for Golden Gate Gateway since March of 2015. 8 years in the admissions and enrollment office under Adam Groza, now about a year and a half as a faculty member. So almost 10 years I've been with this seminary. Earned my MDiv in 2017, earned my PhD in 2022. So yeah, that's a bit of my story. I met my wife on the recruiting trail, Sandra Mashriki, a beautiful Egyptian woman that I met while speaking at the crew meeting at UC Riverside in the fall of 2015. So we met and married in July of 19. We have a little 2.5-year-old named Malachi and a baby girl on the way.
It's a baby girl.
So that's my maybe 7 or 8 minute version of my story of how I got here.
We need to talk.
We do? We're talking right now.
But we'll do it after the podcast.
Okay.
So like I'm tracing your story. I'm watching the arc of your story. So you're called to ministry and then you go full Jonah.
Yep.
Where you're vomited out on a beach with a family that takes you in.
Oh, yeah.
And then it turns to a Saul sort of scenario.
Yeah. I put it like this, trust me, if I don't have any social media, so there's no like old friends from high school who could like see me and be shocked. But if you would have told me or any of my friends at 17, 18 years old that by the time I was like in my 31, that I'd be a PhD in theology working for a seminary, no one would have believed you. I would have laughed at you. So again, people who listen to the podcast who do ministry, I encourage you, like, look, you could take the most foul-mouthed, reprobate, hard-nosed sinner at 16, 17 years old that you know. And by the time they're 30, if the sovereign Lord of heaven gets a hold of them, they can be a seminary professor. Like that's the encouragement of my story, is I'm only here because of the Lord's sovereign grace.
That is a really, really cool story. And it's even true.
Yeah.
It is true. That's not fake news.
Disinformation. It's interesting. I can imagine a narrative, and we're going to try to go this direction in the podcast, where the young reprobate Thor comes to Christ. He gets involved in ministry, then goes off to cemetery,
Yep.
and has his faith shipwrecked, and now he's a
Right.
Bart Ehrman. He's a
Yale Divinity.
Faith deconstructed, faith destroying, and I think there's a narrative, and even with you mentioned with Harvest, and thinking of Calvary Chapel, you hear about Lonnie Frisbee back in Jesus Movement, did this allegorical preaching, long history, as heritage of that in the church, but there is this thing. Some people would say, well, you know what? Listen, the worst thing you could do at that moment when you got that fire of the early faith is to go to academia and have it wrecked. And I think it's a great question, because some people are concerned about that, because there is that story of some people.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question I imagine is like, how did that not happen to you? How did it not happen to me? How can it not happen to other people?
Yeah, that's a great... Did you want to say something, brother?
Well,
Go ahead.
It would cut off all discussion, because it really is God's providence.
Yeah.
Yep.
I've known people who've gone off to liberal schools.
Mm-hmm.
I was just reading the story of Thomas Oden.
Oh,
As a
yeah.
matter of fact.
Really
Oh,
cool.
wow.
And because I was
Methodist
I was
theologian.
getting into his 3-volume
Yep. I'm reading that right now.
systematic. And, I knew he was an Arminian. I knew a little bit about him, but I had to I had to deal with some of the things he said about the Ordo Salutis and So I was reading, and I read about him, and he was a full-blown Marxist in the 50s and 60s.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's a
And he saw a seminary education and the church and Christianity as a vehicle for social justice and Marxism in the world.
It's not new. We talk about it in our own public discourse, but
He was radically turned around
Yep.
at Yale. And
paleo-orthodoxy is kind of the trend these.
and again, you have these, as preachers, you want to preach a good expositional sermon, but there's other people, so we don't want to be sloppy. We don't want to preach these allegorical sermons, but God does use those.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
so Thomas Oden, he was turned around.
He taught at Drew University.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he credited Bultmann
wow.
with his attorney. Yeah, because he said when he encountered Boltmann,
He studied under Boltmann.
Boltmann took the New Testament seriously.
Was he a student of Boltmann?
I think so. I'm not positive.
It would have been early in his days because Boltmann died in like 1962.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be about right.
Maybe at the very end of his career.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know,
Crazy
it's
sit in Boltmann's classes.
Yeah, wow, can you imagine that? And in the German, you got to know, I'm assuming, if you're taking them there. You know, it's interesting, Bo, too, like you said, and we wrote a book, Cameron, on this together, Fathers of an Extensive Country. That's kind of partly what's kind of growing our friendship and even this podcast as well. But we talked about, two main pastors. One was a Dartmouth graduate, one was a Harvard graduate. Both of these pastors, Daniel Merrill, Jonathan Fisher, started their own seminaries in response to liberal in the early 1800s.
Harvard.
Harvard?
In response to Harvard going down.
Harvard goes real liberal about the year 1800. And so there's always this trail of every school starts out with an evangelical heritage. We'll use that example. Starts out, hey, training pastors, training missionaries. In America, in the case of America, built on revival. Princeton, like you said, Jonathan Edwards. And then they get mission drift.
Yep.
And they become like every other.
Yep.
And it's always like, how does that not happen? The providence of God. But I still would ask a question.
The question you asked earlier about how I made it.
Yeah, the short answer is providence. But, But how does providence?
So how does providence flesh itself
the
out?
secondary causes.
Because God uses means, right?
Yep.
God uses means. We are not
ordinary and extraordinary.
That's right. We are not hyper Calvinists. We are biblical Calvinists, Augustinians of the best tradition.
Yep.
So I would say a few things to that. So the first thing I would note is that I had really good professors. So CBU is like a powerhouse right now of undergraduate Bible training. And so but here's the thing, like then you say, well, you have so many of your classmates who didn't, right? But so the problem wasn't the education.
It's good.
All of my professors, and Jeff Mooney was very influential for me, my Old Testament professor and pastor of 6 years. A couple of my philosophy professors like Scott Key and Todd Bates, very, very influential. For me, like Mooney really pushed my nose into the Old Testament and believed every word of it. And so I memorized large swaths of the Old Testament because of him that still proves fruitful to this day, right? My philosophy and apologetics professors forced me to learn how to think and to think clearly and to write clearly and persuasively. But they all had a very high view of the Bible. And so this is sort of a double answer to what you were saying after the question you wanted me to answer. So how do you protect mission drift, and how do you go to a place that will form and shape men and women the way you want? Well, you have to have a high view of the Bible. You have to affirm the doctrine of inerrancy. And more importantly, you have to affirm the doctrine of the sufficiency of Scripture, right? So I said this the other week in class, talking about the doctrines of necessity and sufficiency, right? So you'll hear a lot of churches and associations, denominations, of course the Bible's necessary. But what we forget is that the Bible is sufficient. So we say we need the Bible, necessity, but then sufficiency it is all that we need. And so many churches, schools, denominations, what have you, the reason they begin drifting is they don't believe the Bible is all they need. And so when you believe that it's the Bible and only the Bible, and I'm not talking about a rigid biblicism, right? Like that, but like the Bible is all we need, right? The rightly divided word of truth is what yields eternal fruit, right? So for me, the most important ministerial verse is 2 Corinthians 3:18. We all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed from one degree of glory into another, and this is from the Lord who's the Spirit. So what that Bible passage teaches and promises very clearly is that when you behold the glory of Jesus Christ in the Scriptures, you will become incrementally more like the glory that you see. And that's why as ministers, as pastors, as professors, we want to show people God through Christ in the Bible. Because whether we see it in the moment or not, that will be the superintended divine providential means for God to make his people look more like Jesus. And so that's why we have to believe in the inerrancy, sufficiency, and necessity of the Bible. And so I went to a place that believed that, and I went to a church that believed that and upheld that. And then even going back to like the story of Greg Laurie and Harvest and then Steve Wilburn, the funny thing is Steve Wilburn is like, he's not seminary trained. He is the opposite of Calvinistic. But he is, and he used to be the youth pastor at Harvest and then became the Sunday night guy, and then he planted his own church out in LA. There is a dozen, if not more, young men who got called to ministry under him, who are no longer at Harvest, but either planted or replanted or are pastoring churches that are of a very different stripe from Harvest or Calvary. So, but again, it's like Steve just was trying to faithfully teach the Bible. And it's like this unashamed, faithful Bible teaching. Doesn't have to be perfect, but the Lord's word is perfect. And God's word will always accomplish the purposes for which he sends it. That's the promise of the text. And so for me, that was my experience. And so anyone who talks about cemetery doesn't get it. Like either you are not approaching your studies correctly, or you have professors or teachers who are not teaching correctly. There's because of what Paul promises, there should never be a vain moment where you're studying the Bible and you're not spiritually transformed.
Not worshiping.
Ever. Like, so either you're doing it wrong or your professor's doing it wrong.
Well, Bo, that makes me want to ask you a question, just kind of about your story as being both a lay elder, lay scholar. I've gotten so many books from you, great books.
I love sharing books to this day.
I know. Your wife wants
I go to the thrift stores. I know what I'm looking for, and I know who I want to buy them for.
I appreciate all you give me. But tell me a little bit about your story, because you didn't formally go to seminary, but you would have the equivalent, I would say, of the knowledge base that would come from the seminary education.
Yeah, perhaps undergrad or Bible school or something like that. But in my case, I early on got involved in apologetics, and so I was dealing with doctrine, and the people I was around all the time, we were focused on people outside the faith or in cults or different religions, and so along the way, I would be among other people who were having these theological discussions in what I would consider a confrontational setting. We'd be talking about baptismal regeneration and Mormons, and so I'm with Lutherans, I'm with Episcopalians, Baptists, and we're having this cordial discourse. So that's where I was kind of getting my understanding of theology, and people were giving me books to read, and fortunately for me, the people that I was around pointed me to good books. So I got into that. But by that time, I'm already married. I have 2 or 3 children, 2, and then 3 eventually. And I lived in Nevada City, which, if you go back before the time of the internet and so forth, there were no seminaries or even Bible schools anywhere nearby.
No, they're not.
And so like you could go to the Luther Rice Seminary, and they would have a correspondence course or something like that. So I kind of put myself in a position where that would have been really difficult to do in the first place. But I was given a real healthy love of study and books, which I was a dismal student. I graduated from high school with a 1.2 GPA.
Shut up. How do you graduate?
A 1.2, right? That's like a D plus, right? And I remember
back when a D was technically passing still.
2 months before.
I thought you have a 2.0 to graduate.
No, it was a 1.2, because I looked up when we lived in Maine. I was going through old records, and I found my report cards, and they were worse than I remember. And so anyway, I had a similar story to yours.
My GPA was a bit different, though, just so you know.
Because you were doing the work and yeah. I was just
not to toot my own horn, but I just want to say that.
Well,
beep beep.
He just dominated. No, so for me, it wasn't a matter of rebellion or anything. I just wasn't interested in it, and I knew I just wanted to graduate, get a good union job with benefits, marry my wife, have kids, buy a house, and mow the lawn. That was my
the American dream, man.
Yeah, I've never been real super ambitious or anything. So coming to learn that I enjoyed learning and books, and would probably really enjoy going to seminary now. And there were times that I thought I would eventually.
It's never too late.
Yeah, that's true. And now I can go to William Jessup, Western's right down the hill.
Gateway's down the hill.
Gateway, yep.
Yep.
You'd have to feel offended if I didn't try to get you to come to seminary during this podcast.
Go for it.
It'd be as if you went to a used car lot and they didn't try to sell you a car. You're like, what's wrong with me? Can I not buy a car?
Yeah, absolutely.
We talk about scholarship options.
So I think a lot of it has to do with you got to be motivated. And I run into a lot of people that they're not motivated, and I don't fault them for that. They're not interested in like we get together with some guys on Tuesday mornings. There's about 5 or 6 of us, and we're going through systematic theology, and I intend to do that until I die.
Yep.
Every Tuesday morning, and I don't. There's other people making a living, and they have other interests and other callings, so I don't look down on them. But no, I just enjoy it. And I do tell people, because I know I can tell some people they act like, well, is there something wrong with me that I'm not into the Bible too much? And I tell them, okay, look, I'm a Christian like you. I have the same interest in the scriptures and knowing God that you do. But you have hobbies, and my hobby is reading theology. I mean, I really enjoy it. Mm-hmm. So it's not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
I don't expect everybody to enjoy it as much as I do.
You definitely have, I mean, obviously kind of an ingrained and maybe also taught good habit of learning.
Yeah. And
because in seminary, just stop reading the books, right?
And you have the habit of reading.
And I don't know where it came from. Like, I hated to read in high school. I did not read. I literally don't. I know I had to do homework at some point. I literally don't remember doing homework in school. So I would test well, so I could get by.
Yeah, intelligence is there.
So for me, this is why I'm really big on the scriptures and God's word.
Yep.
Is because once I became a Christian, I became a reader. I was never a reader until Jesus.
Christianity moves towards learning. I mean, it does.
It's the greatest literacy movement in history.
Yep.
Because God speaks in a book.
It speaks in the book. You got to learn. It's interesting. I think, some people wonder, well, what's, seminary? Is it just a kind of social acceptance stamp, and it's not, because I think in theory, Bo, people...
I think seminary disciplines you. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
For a person like me, for me to go to seminary, it would help me to be disciplined, focused, and get the kind of formal things that I am missing. Like I never took logic, which I run into that all the time with myself. I go, Bo, you don't know logic. You don't know how to reason.
In all your books, you've never read like Aristotle's works on logic, or like just a textbook on modern logic?
Well, I have the Copy Logic book.
Okay.
Is that still used as a textbook?
I know the logic book that I took in my philosophy was like this gray book with like stones on the front. And it's modern logic. I still want to read Aristotle's classic logic. So that's
I need to read that still.
I did, and that would be the thing. I was working all the time and raising kids, so it was catch as catch can. And so, yes, like I've gotten the first semester of Greek. I've done it 3 times. The first semester 3 times. And I've delved into my logic books and so forth until something called me away. So
yeah, and Bo, and Cameron as well, it reminds us of this complex tension that we're failing, because we're thinking like, okay, like, hey, there's gaps in our learning, and then there's this specter of unbelief when you go to academia, and then there is Joe Blow, or a guy with a name we can't pronounce in a country who doesn't even have a complete Bible, who is still preaching, and you're thinking like, all of this and all this, God accomplishes his mission, but what does he expect of me? And I do think there's a contextual aspect of this. That
it's the place where God has placed you.
Yeah. Exactly. And not everyone actually has the same opportunity to even do basic seminary courses or the time. And the balance of courses that, it's funny. I mean, I'm like you guys, I have a Bible reading plan, and I go through some of these Old Testament books this time of year, like Zechariah, and I was reading through it, the last 3 chapters. And I was like, if I didn't have even some of the knowledge I have, how would I ever preach this book? How would I be able? I mean, the ESV, I'm doing my cheater notes in my ESV study Bible.
I remember there was a note in my NIV teen study Bible, the one that I memorized the Bible with, so it's like still in my head. But it was one of those like going earlier about like, Calvary Chapel and end time stuff. There was a note probably in the 12th chapter of Zechariah where it talks about like people standing and like tongues melting
14,
and eyes
chapter
melting.
14, right there.
And so it says
Indiana
like,
Jones.
There's a little blue box right in the second column of that left page where it's like talking about, eschatological experts say that this text refers to the atom bomb.
No way.
Oh yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, and I thought where you were going is the text box says, watch the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's right.
No, that's I think it's
Because it
inspired
captures
from
it
that.
so well.
No,
it
but it was
does
like
capture.
the prophecy experts say that this is a veiled reference to the dropping of an atomic bomb. Wow. So again, it's the assumed futuristic understanding of eschatology, but like so much of it is like if you don't have a seminary education, you're just going to read the Bible in a clear, simple way. And so, like, obviously the earth is young. Obviously it's pre-mill dispensational. Like, it's just clear.
Yep.
And so, like, that's where you have
Obviously,
to
Antichrist is the European Union. UN. Okay, well, maybe
the bear is Russia.
the
like,
bear is Russia. Yeah.
Except when you ask a Russian Christian, how do you feel about that? Like,
Well,
He's Ukrainian.
You brought up something earlier, Cameron, and I don't, obviously this is about you. We want to hear from you, but you brought up something. One of the things that evidently I intuited in my reading, this is pretty weird, I think, but around 2000 or something, I realized that all the best books, all the best commentators, all the best scholars I was reading, they were pastors.
mm-hmm.
And then I read about A.T. Robertson,
Yep.
who failed as a pastor when he was young. He had like a nervous breakdown. And so that's why he went into all in on the academic side. So even though he had this desire to be a pastor,
scholar.
but he was Baptist,
I did not know he was
Yeah,
Baptist.
A.T. Robertson.
Wow.
Not John A.T. Robertson.
Not John A.T. Robertson.
Not-
A.T. Robertson.
A.T. Robertson,
Okay.
Word Pictures in the New Testament.
Yeah, I think I have
And
that
all
book.
the lexical stuff. Yeah, and but the point being is, I found that people like Calvin, who was a pastor,
Oh, yeah.
when I read the Institutes, that's pleasure reading for me.
Oh, yeah.
His commentaries are woody, like you would expect
They're
from
woody.
a lawyer. They're a little more, chop and block, and he's chopping up logic, and he's responding to Rome,
Yep.
and they're great.
But the thought is a lot of those are his sermons, right?
Yeah.
Lectures. Some of their
Yeah.
Yeah,
intercoms
lectures, sermons, and they're then being edited into a commentary.
So do you think the Institutes were like written towards more of a common audience? Because I find them, really.
Well, you remember the first one was written in French.
Yeah.
It was written in French to fit into your big pocket
Yeah.
of the day. So, like, it was supposed to be read in mass.
He was only
Yeah.
27 years old when he wrote that.
That's crazy.
But so, by the way, friends, for those of you on the audience here, some of these names were dropping: Boltman, A.T. Robertson. If you have a question, hey, just put in the comment section. Hey, please explain who this person is. Copy and paste something.
If you wonder who John Calvin is, you shouldn't ask. Like, you should just leave the podcast.
No.
Basic knowledge.
No.
I'm kidding.
You know what
Yes.
though? You know what's surprising though? Cameron,
but to that point, like if you talk about how a layman who wants to learn, that's what I did. I always looked at the references,
Yeah.
and I found out who before the internet,
Yeah.
which was difficult. Who are these people? Where do they come from?
Yep.
And that's how I learned that the people that I really appreciated and got the most from were pastors
Yeah.
outside of the academy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So yeah, a lot of people, it's surprising sometimes. People that are honest will just say, "I don't know who that person is," and it's a great humbling thing to be able to learn from the very beginning what's going on. I remember when I first started seminary, my sister, who's a Biola graduate, is in their Torrey Honors Institute. It's like kind of an elite thing, classical.
Yeah.
All her books, I stole all the books basically and read them myself. But she was just, I remember I said something about ecclesiology. I didn't know what that was, and she was kind of like, pfft. Because I'm like, you're a seminary student, you don't know what the word ecclesiology is, like my first semester. I was like, what? So I was like, everything was new because I didn't go to CBU thinking I was going to be teaching theology or even being a pastor.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was like one of those out. I wasn't the BAT students, but you do find out something about the students that go from, like you said, youth group stars is a great phrase. Mm-hmm. Thinking they're going to ministry and then go into the program and they get to read some of this stuff, but man, sometimes there's a little bit of arrogance there.
Oh, there is arrogance. And how many of my classmates at Cal Baptist were saying that I want to get a PhD? Like, I want to be just like these professors that I idolize.
Yeah.
None of them have one. None of them.
Really?
And many of them aren't in ministry anymore. And it's like, there I was at the time thinking, I want to be a pastor. Like, I don't want a PhD. Everyone's telling me to get a PhD. I want to be a pastor. It's like, here I am, not a pastor with a PhD. I don't know how to explain that other than the providence of God. But there is so much arrogance in young men and young pastors that it's, and even scholars. Like, I really don't like hanging around scholars. I hate ETS. it's just the worst. Like
It has a
Wait,
weird feel to it.
Hold it. Can we go back and edit that? Because you're going to have a future at ETS. Do you want to? No,
maybe edit that out.
I'm just kidding.
I'm not going.
However, they
But if they hear it, like you should hear it, brothers. Like there is feigned humility that is just irritating to me.
there is a lot of
Preach.
that. There is a lot of that though.
Like, oh God, I just got this book and this. It's the equivalent when you hear Pastor, well, Mike, I had 300 people last Sunday and I baptized 15, and
Yeah.
it's like, well, I wrote this commentary. There's a reason why, like, the only social media I have is LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And how many times I'm on a LinkedIn and I see a pastor, I have one guy in particular who I'm thinking of in Southern California, or like one of
Oh, it's not me. Okay.
No. A faculty member who I know, it's like, it's always on LinkedIn. Like, here's my latest sermon. Check it out if you want to listen. Here's my latest article. I'm like, dude, could you be like, are you self-promoting enough? Like, if I ever get an article, I don't tell anyone. Like, I don't put my sermons up for people to listen to. I don't have a podcast, though people have told me I should have one, because I don't think so highly of myself that my thoughts should be shared with everyone.
Well, this is your initial podcast to launch. We're going to
Boy, this
tune you again.
podcast is just too real.
Yeah. It's interesting.
This is
Raw
the
and
one
real,
that's gonna
man.
get us
Yeah. Oh, this is
canceled
raw. I
and
know.
Demonetized,
Hate.
and nobody's going to smash that like button.
Oh my gosh, that's funny, man. It is interesting. One I would say this too about it is that probably the biggest temptation that all of us face if we do education is envy.
Yeah.
It is probably the vice I would say of most guys that are pastors, and because I've published some stuff like you have too, and there is immense internal pressure and envy that isn't ever. It's just within your heart, and you realize what vanity this is.
Yeah.
But I feel it.
Well, it's like Ecclesiastes says, to the writing of books, there'll be no end.
There'll be no end. And part of you has to laugh at yourself. And I think one thing, I remember we went to one of the seminars. I think you would have probably been an end of student because you're 6 years younger than me. But Roy Oswald, he wrote a commentary on Isaiah. And he went, I think, University of Michigan or, went to, a state school, but one of the elite ones for, like a non-seminary PhD.
Bible degree or something.
Yeah, it was a PhD in Old Testament, I think, University of Michigan. And someone said, how did you go there and not lose your faith? And he gave a great response because it was simple. He's like, I was involved in a local church.
That's right. The local church.
So like, there's a humbling way. Like, this is what it is about. And
Where
Odin,
somebody's going to approach you after a sermon and critique you
Oh, yeah.
critique
on
you.
your doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Or like Odin. Like Odin says at the beginning of we mentioned Thomas Odin, his systematic theology. I'm about a third of the way through it, and he says like, there's something funny about theology, like that you're writing about God.
Oh, yeah.
You're just a mere man or a mere
Yes.
woman. Like you're
Yeah,
just
yeah.
like, so you should laugh at yourself. Like, you know what?
So let me ask you this, because you guys are in the academy, and I would have thought that you would start at this level and get down to serious things, serious character issues like envy. You started with envy. You started at the bottom. As a layman, my mind would be, where does acceptance in the guild come, and where does wanting to earn a living or being published? And I think of George Eldon Ladd, who, the story is once he got published, he was so concerned about acceptance in the guild or by others that it drove him. He died. He became an alcoholic.
Oh,
No.
wow.
Yeah, and John Piper talks about his, how sad his ending was. But John Piper said it was well known that at Fuller, when he got his first check from the publisher, he felt like he'd finally been accepted.
Lad.
Yeah, and he was.
And did Piper study under him?
I think he did. Yeah, because he's in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And he was, going down the halls at Fuller saying,
Wow.
and he was crushed by the first critical review of his.
Those are very different. Those are very painful to get through.
Yeah, and so that's the
should
story
read 'em
behind
now.
Ladd is that he
Yeah,
was
I've read-
crushed with his first
Yeah.
foray into the academy.
Yeah.
and he spent like most of his adult life trying to be accepted. Really.
Yeah. We all want to belong.
Yeah.
That is an idol. It is a brutal idol.
Okay, so
It is
the
Molech.
acceptance and making a living. Where do those come into the?
As in, you're thinking like if at what point?
Because you guys have identified that there's envy.
Yeah.
You can.
Oh, some of the
what are-
aspirational things.
Yeah, what are some of the pitfalls of going to seminary? You have the envy, which is, I think, a deep one. But
Yeah, but I think also too there is a certain contempt for the it could be a contempt for the lay person, or a contempt maybe for what you've learned, and maybe like the inadequacy, like, man, I grew up in this church, and like the simplistic way they think, and there could be a lot of that prideful contempt for that, maybe some of the stuff that goes on there, and I think that's a temptation. I think it's less of a temptation if you're serving as a pastor, because you get humbled. And I was in a small church when I first started out. Really that long ago. I've been out here 2.5 years, but there's a way it really humbled me, because the people there didn't. They were like, we don't care that you're doing a PhD. We're not helping you. We're not supportive of that. And your preaching's too boring, and it's too long, and we don't really care about that. And I was like, man, this hurt. Like, wow. So he's like, I don't really care what you think, And I was like, I told Janae, so there's a passage in Lamentations says, good for a young man to bear the yoke in his youth. So it's like, it's really good. I was like, it's humbling for me. They never really appreciated it. They didn't help pay for it.
Yep.
And it was good for my heart.
Yeah.
And it helped me a lot to really like not think too highly of myself.
At least for me, to your question, sir, I mean, so what you said about envy and desire, and like, well, I'm going to be different than the church I was a part of, and I'm going to be a better pastor than my bad pastor was. That's very wrong. The other thing that I see in seminary is people going just for the credential. It's like, I'm just going to go in and I need this. And this is especially true in ethnic churches. Like
Currency.
You have to have the MDiv to be a pastor. Like in a Korean church, for example, you're never going to be a moksanim unless you have an MDiv. So like there is often just this credentialing, which is wrong.
You can tell when you have students.
For sure. Like it's just the bare minimum. And so there's tons of either the credentialing idea, or like, I'm going to go in and try to make something of myself, or I'm going to be somebody, or I'm going to prove someone wrong. Like those are all very bad motives. And those will shipwreck you. Mm-hmm. But for me, the way God has always kept me humble was I one of those providential conversations that happened when I was in college. I was someone who did have a cagey Calvinist stage. Luckily, it was a lot shorter of a period. And I had a problem with wanting to be accepted. And that goes back to the issues I had with my dad and a desire to be affirmed and to be liked. And I had one particular conversation with my pastor, Jeff Mooney, who laid into me.
Who laid into you?
Oh, laid into me. He said, Cameron, I see what you're doing. Like that is a brutal idol. He said the desire for acceptance is a brutal idol that you'll never achieve. And so there's a few like that. And then there was this, I kid you not, it's too long of a story to tell how I got to this point, but I was doing ministry for about 1.5 years with this young group of guys who thought we were going to plant the world's biggest church in Redlands. And we had a prophecy and everything. So I can't go down that road.
Oh.
Anyways, so we are out in San Bernardino, which if anyone knows it, San Bernardino is one of the roughest cities in California.
Oh my goodness.
We're in the, what I would call the middle of San Bernardino, which is the freeway box of the 210, the 10, and the 215. There's the freeway box. Yep. And we're dead in the middle near like the county courthouse. So like the projects are right there. And we're out there, a bunch of young white kids in our 20s sharing the gospel in the hood, man. We actually had one of the police combat units, like the big, came up to said, guys, what are you doing here? Like, you should not be here.
No way.
And we're out there just sharing the gospel. So I'll never forget, we were going up just to cars, which was not safe. And we went up to this one car, and there's this older African-American guy sitting in the car. And so me and this guy, Ethan, who I was living with in this big house we're living in together, because we're in this commune idea, right? We're going to plant this church. It's going to be great. Oh. The pillars of the faith. Anyway, so there we are. I'll never forget this conversation. I can think of it just like it was yesterday.
Church.
Yeah. And so we're having this conversation with this older African-American guy. Looked like he's in his 60s, but the dude was like 89. He's old. He's now with the Lord. Like, he was old as dirt. Looked great. And we're talking with him, and we're sharing the gospel. And eventually we get to the end, and we're about to make the offer of it, the gospel. And he says, young man, let me stop you. Thank you for sharing with me. Thank you for taking the time. I want you to know that I'm a deacon of this church. I've been going to this church for decades. I've been a Christian since I was like 15. The dude's like 89 or 90. And then he looks at me. I'll never forget this. He turns to me and he says, young man, I have a word for you. Oh. And he says, young man, you need to know that all that you know, you only know because the Lord has let you know it. And it was like, and then my friend Ethan looked at me. He's like, I've always wanted to say that to you. And I have never forgot that conversation. And so the Lord has kept me humble to this day. It's like, look, if I have any intellectual abilities, any things that I know, I only know it because it's like what Paul says, what do you have that you have not received?
Yep.
So any of this,
boast if you do.
All that you have, you've been given. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights above. Like, so everything I have, I've been given. So like, I just can't be arrogant about it. Like, you just can't. You have to recognize everything you have, God's given you, and rejoice in who you are. Like earlier about this idea of like lad and being confident. The last thing I would say on that point is there was this talking about podcasts and YouTube. I like fitness, personal fitness. I was a trainer for a while. This guy I like is athlete next name Jeff Cavalier, like one of the biggest guys on YouTube. And he was talking about the idea of needing to be secure in who you are and in what you can achieve, and not go after like, supplements and like the bad supplements like steroids and human growth hormone. He's like, you can't, because you're chasing the unicorn. And he said, you have to recognize that there's two ways to have the biggest tower in a city. You either build the biggest effing tower or you knock all the other towers down.
Knock all the towers.
And so what I've learned is so many people in this world aren't confident enough to build the biggest tower or to be comfortable with how big of a tower they can build. So they're so radically insecure they have to tear everyone else down. And so I say to people, and I've talked about this a lot in sermons, right? Paul says, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. It is easier to weep with those who weep because you're condescending to someone who's lower than you. It's much harder to rejoice with those who are rejoicing because then you have to move up and they have something you don't. What if they got the job that you also applied for? What if they got the scholarship that you didn't get or the church that you wanted? No, you're supposed to rejoice with them, and you have to be humble enough and confident enough in the station to which the Lord has called you that you can truly be glad in your heart for your brother in the Lord. So like those are some of the key things for me that the Lord has kept in my heart to keep me humble and to remind me of what I have and to be confident in what I have and to be thankful for it. But still, like Paul said, 1 Corinthians 15, I worked harder than everyone else, but not I who worked with the Lord who worked in me.
Yeah.
So you work as hard as you can and be comfortable with the outcomes.
Yeah.
So you have the right motives to earn a PhD, right? And you're doing a level of work, which would get you good six figures in any other vocation.
It's true. I was going to say, what six figure?
Yes, in
That's
any
right.
other vocation.
If you did the work in another vocation.
But you're choosing to go to seminary.
Yeah.
So is there going to be some, some sort of tension there about, hey, I'm not getting what I deserve, or, I mean, is money going to be an issue?
Well,
to seminarians.
Yeah. Different from my story. I mean, I think we probably, honestly, with the sake of time, we could probably end up maybe do another podcast on the similar theme and talk about that a bit too, about the money issue, because that's a whole different perspective of providing a living. I do think that, like what Cameron said, I think is critical for me is, and this is true of wherever you are, if you're serving in a worship team, you're serving a pastor, is the ability to listen to those outside you, even a stranger that God used. And I think that's a credible story.
That is an awesome thing. For me, I just want to say that illustrates God's providence.
Oh, yeah.
That illustrates the different members in the church with the Spirit powerfully at work. That was a pneumatic experience.
It was, and that dude was in my life for like 5 minutes and has had a profound effect on who I am.
And then downstream, who's that going to affect through
this podcast?
You? Because it's in you that you receive that from the Spirit, and now it's that attitude is in you. You're going to impart it to others, and you're going to exude that in one-on-one experiences. In a pastoral, you know what I'm saying? So you can't even measure the effects of that.
Well, I think that's a great point for us, man, to maybe sum this up and just, hey, if you would like to be interested in seminary, talk to us in the comments, or
please let me know.
The camera know, and it's like all these conversations, we could go on forever, and I think it's incredible. But I
so are you looking for that gateway, that gateway decision on my part, like?
There's one person out here who needs to make a decision.
Yeah, one person. I'm not getting off until that one person.
Don't go home.
That's right.
You never know if your car's going to make it back to Nevada City.
And you'll never have a chance again.
Well, the Lord's at your heart knocking, brother. Just say yes. Open the door and sup with him.
Well, we will be off now, and see you guys soon. Subscribe, like, share, and not to promote us, but maybe because you saw this as beneficial. God bless. Peace out.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Cameron.